Julia, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you?
Awesome. Thanks for taking some time between your segments on CNBC to hang with us for a few minutes.
It's my pleasure. It's been great to talk to you about these issues and get to connect with you about my book, and I'm thrilled to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, Tiffany and I are psyched to get to chat with you. Maybe it'd be helpful just for folks, our audience is mostly founders, entrepreneurs, other investors. Just a little bit of your background and sort of how you got to where you are, and then obviously why you decided to write this amazing book.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I am CNBC's senior media and tech reporter. I've been an on-air reporter for CNBC for the past 16 and a half years. I started off covering media, then I added social media, now I cover tech as well. And one of my favorite things I do at CNBC is something that your audience may be familiar with, and that is the CNBC Disruptor 50 list. Mm-hmm. I created it about 11 years ago, and I've always been fascinated by entrepreneurs and innovators, and I wanted to figure out how to talk about startups in a context that makes sense with CNBC's focus on public investing. So we create this list to look at the fast-growing startups that are either disrupting the current public giants or going to become the public giants in the future. That's been one of my favorite projects at CNBC, and it's kind of my passion project. And interestingly, that project sort of led me to write my book, When Women Lead. And here's why. In doing these interviews with CEOs of the Disruptor 50 list, I noticed obviously that women were in a tiny minority. And in my time at CNBC, and I was at Fortune magazine before that for 6 years, I've interviewed literally thousands of CEOs and founders. And the vast majority of them have been men. The vast majority of them have been white men. And what I started to notice among the startup founders is there were more women entering the scene, especially in the past 5 years or so, more women founders, co-founders. And I was really struck by the fact that, first of all, there were more of them. And second of all, I really saw them starting to address different problems with their companies, solving different kinds of solutions, creating different kinds of solutions for consumers. And also they were really approaching their businesses differently. So on one hand, I was finding them very interesting and different than their male counterparts. And I was also seeing the data about just how rare they are. So if you look at the Fortune 500, currently about 8.5% of the Fortune 500 has a female CEO. If you look at the startup space, the amount of VC funding going to female founders is very relatively low. So last year, about 2%, or I think it was 2021. I forget, we're already in 2023. In 2021,
we can all forget last year.
Yeah, I know. In 2021, about 2% of all venture capital dollars went to female founded companies. About 16% went to co-ed founding teams, and 82% of all VC dollars went to companies with all male founders and co-founders. So I saw that these women who were succeeding were in a tiny minority. And I wanted to understand how they had defied the odds and how they had managed to be so successful despite the fact that they were in a tiny minority. And so I sort of started this project to tell some of their inspiring stories. And I think there are some amazing stories of female founders that people aren't familiar with. And the media tends to focus on just a handful of names, and also to be fascinated by the high profile failures of people like Elizabeth Holmes, which really don't define anything about the startup space at all, as you well know. So I start off just wanting to tell their stories. And then the more women I interviewed, and thanks to the magic of Zoom and the pandemic, I ended up interviewing about 120 people. I started to see these key commonalities emerge in terms of the way women were leading. And then from that, I said, if there are key commonalities, I need to find the research to explain this. And I ended up diving into the research and read about 300 academic studies. And I found some amazing research and data about how women are more likely to lead, why women lead that way, and also how those leadership skills and strategies are incredibly valuable, not just for women, but for everyone. So the book, When Women Lead, ultimately is a combination of the stories of dozens of inspiring female founders with academic research explaining what it is that they're doing and why their skills and strategies are so effective and great models for anyone.
Well, I'm glad you did write it. Love the book. It's amazing. And
thank you.
You mentioned, the inspiring stories. They really are. And Jeff and I meet a lot of female founders and are actually lucky to work with, several who you profile in your book. So
Who are the ones that you work with who are in my book? You have to
Shivani Soraya and Deidre Paknod from Workboard.
They're both awesome and so
They're
different
amazing.
from each other. So different from each other. Both have such different companies, Tala and Workboard, and really both approaching problem solving in totally different ways and to such great success. I love just like how these totally diverse women are finding such amazing ways to change the business landscape.
Yeah, they are both powerhouses. Would describe them in many, many different ways, but incredible. And, I think like what you said is true, right? We are seeing a lot more female founders, female execs. I mean, I'm certainly seeing more women in VC, which is also really inspiring because I think it does take things on both sides of the table, to make change. But, maybe you met a ton of people and you did a lot of interviews, and you mentioned some of the commonalities. Like, could you share some of the things that you see, and, what are those nuances or kind of what are the leadership qualities that you see across all the women you interviewed?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. And by the way, it is important to have more female investors because statistically, female investors are twice as likely as male investors to invest in a female founder. And so a lot of that is just about pipeline. Like you, Tiffany, might just have different founders coming to you than if you didn't have so many high profile women at the firm. So I think that's a really important piece of this. So one thing that's interesting is, you mentioned Shivani Soraya and Deidre Paknod. They could not be more different. Their companies could not be more different. Their approaches to management and leadership could not be more different. But one key commonality I found across all these women is a real authenticity to their leadership style. And I feel like sometimes that word is overused, and I actually really don't use that word much in the book. But this idea that they're both leading in ways that are really true to who they are. Neither of them is trying to fit themselves into a box of what leadership is supposed to look like. And Jeff, just to go back to my story, I started as a reporter at Fortune magazine in 2000. And back then, the model of leadership was Jack Welch, GE leadership. And I'm sure you remember this.
Oh, yeah,
and
of course.
That was what everyone thought leadership was supposed to look like for everyone. And it's been interesting. I've sort of been reflecting on how these sort of leadership trends go in waves. And what was so interesting for me in seeing these women succeed with totally unique leadership styles is that they didn't fit themselves into any box. They were not trying to be a Jack Welch Six Sigma leader. They were not trying to lead like men who had done things before them. They were just saying, what am I good at? How do I think I'm most effective? And let me try to lead in those ways. So I think this combination of authenticity and also humility was a common through thread. Not that these women aren't incredibly aggressive and confident and competent, but they have a humility about what their capabilities are and what they need to learn and who they need to surround themselves with to be more successful. So those are, I think, are overarching traits, and obviously valuable for anyone. But then a couple of key things that emerge both in the research and in the interviews as things that women leaders are more likely to do, and one of them is empathy. This idea that women tend to rank higher on empathy tests, the ability to guess what someone is feeling or thinking based on their appearance, based on their outward sort of behavior, not necessarily what they're saying. And interestingly, a number of people I've talked to recently are like, well, empathy isn't that just about being nice? Isn't that about being nurturing? Like, no, empathy is actually empathy can lead to compassion, and empathy often does lead to compassion, but the ability to understand what someone is thinking or feeling can be so strategic, can enable you to be a smarter and stronger negotiator because you're like, I know what they're really thinking, or I know what they're actually going through. So this is going to help me come up with a better solution. So empathy is key. And I do think it's so important to separate that from kindness or compassion or nurturing. It's really separate. Another one is vulnerability. Women are more likely to lead with vulnerability and to use vulnerability as an opportunity to invite collaboration, whether it's I need to hire someone to take the lead on data science because it's not an area of my strength, and then inviting those people to really take the baton and run with it, if you will. So that's found to be really great in terms of motivating and offering independence to employees. And then another one, which was really surprising to me, is gratitude. Women are more likely to practice gratitude. Women actually enjoy the feeling of gratitude more than men do. But I think we should break men out of that, Jeff, because gratitude is found to correlate with patience and longer term planning and decision making. And it basically, the researchers have found that if you feel grateful for where you are in the moment and you remind yourself why you should feel grateful, you don't feel as anxious to have the near term win. You could say, okay, we're okay right now. Let's figure out what's going to be best for the long run. Obviously, oftentimes men do lead with these strategies as well, but it is something that is found that women are more likely to do these things. And then another key one is communal leadership. Figuring out strategies to bring in the best perspectives from across an organization rather than a more traditional top-down leadership approach, which, speaking of Six Sigma, is something that, was a more traditionally male leadership style. And I can go on, but then another key one, and I think this is really relevant to Shivani and Tala, women are much more likely to found companies with an additional purpose in addition to just
this is the thing I was going to highlight, because you also talk about Whitney at Bumble. We're lucky to back Carolyn at Chief.
Oh, great.
These are companies that are started with an opportunity in mind that I don't think men would have seen. And not many people understand that about Tala, but that is a really important element of what Shivani's built. She saw a need in developing countries, particularly with women, because they don't have access to capital.
But what's interesting is that she is creating a company that in its success will be incredibly profitable, serve millions of people, but also is helping people. Mm-hmm. And it's not a buy one, give one model where, there are plenty of companies that in their success, they'll donate money, but we are more likely to find women create companies that in their financial success have a social or environmental benefit. That's a perfect example of what Tala is doing. They're not a nonprofit. There are plenty of microloans organizations that are nonprofits. Shivani didn't want to do a nonprofit because she knew she could have a bigger impact as a for-profit company. And she saw the opportunity in aligning financial success and social impact. And I would say now more than ever, if you're trying to motivate employees, hire employees, retain employees, reminding employees of what that additional purpose is for a company is really valuable. So the fact that women are more likely to found purpose-driven companies and there's a lot of opportunity in purpose-driven companies, I think is something really worth flagging right now.
So you and I were chatting a few weeks ago, I think it was before the break, and we were talking about okay, if we acknowledge all of these issues, fewer women in venture capital, fewer women founders, how do we make inroads on that? And I can share, obviously, I am a white male. I happen to have 3 daughters who I'm very proud of and excited for their future. And we as a firm, I think, have been pretty proactive in trying to create more opportunity. We have a very diverse firm. We've been a big sponsor of All Raise and big supporter with Aileen. And I think we're always trying to ask ourselves, what more can we do? And how do we influence others in our industry to do more? And, Tiffany and I had the amazing experience of working together while she was out on maternity leave. And I think that experience went well. And so one of the things I try to tell my friends at other firms is that's one thing you can do. Be proactive and try to help somebody be successful in that experience. And your story in your book about your maternity leave, I think I told you, just blew me away about the lack of understanding. And maybe it was because it was it was, maybe we're in a different era now, but I doubt it. Right. I think,
I do things have changed. Yeah. I think things have changed a lot. So my older son is 11.
Share your story about.
Well, my older son is 11 and my younger son is 8. And when I came back from maternity leave, there were no lactation rooms where I could pump anywhere. That just wasn't a thing. It wasn't an option. And I mean, I don't know which story you're referencing.
Just the story about, you mentioned some colleague wanted to rub your belly, and
colleagues, people I was interviewing. I interview people for CNBC, and I remember when I was due in March with my second kid. So I remember CES, I was due 2 months after CES. So I was enormously pregnant at CES. And I would sit there at the Consumer Electronics Show and people would come in, and I must have done 8 live interviews that year. And I would be sitting there with my enormous belly, and men would come in and try to rub my belly. They would rub my belly before we went on camera. And yes, I was massively pregnant, but it was either people would comment on it, the fact that I was so pregnant, or they would just touch my body in a way that feels so weird. And, but this was, hopefully things have changed in the past 8 years. But I was just back at CS and thinking about how hilarious that was.
I guess what do you, if Tiffany and I were to go try and be emissaries to help, you've done all this research, you've done all this work. we want to fund more women entrepreneurs. We
Yeah.
want to see more women in venture capital. I believe it makes a difference. We have a project that we put together with All Raise to put more women on boards. That's been wildly successful. That is making a difference. I can tell you, sitting in the boardroom with a more diverse board.
Yeah.
You know, when I was raising money 25 years ago, the classic scenario was you raised money and then you got, you know, your uncle's friend John to be on your board, and that was it. And now I think we have a much more coherent process in Silicon Valley, and you see a lot more diversity on boards. We still have a lot of work to do. But what other suggestions do you have for things that we, as people of influence who are giving capital to the next generation of founders, can do?
Well, one thing I think that is really key is identifying this as a financial opportunity. Like, look, Jeff, you have daughters, you want women to have opportunity because you understand it's the right thing for the world. But I really think it's important to frame this, especially for the venture community, as a financial opportunity and to not make it a philanthropic endeavor.
Right.
Tiffany is a partner at the firm, not because she's a woman, but because you're so grateful to have her perspective and understand there's financial value in having different perspectives. And she's bringing in different deal flow, and she has a different understanding of different markets. And I just think that there needs to be a shift in the dialogue about why people should be investing in women. And there's so much data that I gather in my book about the outperformance of female-led companies. So one thing that's interesting is, and I think we're seeing this now, and Jeff, we talked about this a little bit before, is oftentimes women are reluctant to take capital and don't even pitch and would rather bootstrap and have lower outcomes and say, I'm not going to be beholden to investors. I'm not going to have the risk associated with that. And I'm not going to bang my head against the wall and pitch to 100 people and not raise money. But I think because of the data and the statistic, yes, women don't pitch to VCs as much as men do. But I think part of that is because of the stats. And I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but I think that there is such financial opportunity in investing in women and also in having women on boards. And one thing that was really important for me was to have the 40 pages of endnotes in my book and print them in the book rather than putting them online, because a lot of those endnotes are referring to the research about how publicly traded companies run by women have outperformance, financial outperformance in terms of the stock. You have the fact that companies that raise VC funding that are run by women tend to go public or sell a year earlier on average. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's certainly notable and worth knowing, especially in economic times like these. Women tend to hit profitability faster, and part of that might be because they have less access to venture capital. But in times like these, when it's harder to raise money, the fact that women tend to be scrappier and do more with less is obviously a good thing. So for me, I just think it's really important to not make investing in women a nice thing to do. It's not. It's a smart thing to do financially. And I think if you look at the diversity of the country and the world and the people who were everyone's trying to serve with products and services, it's really important to have investors who understand those markets. There's a lot of talk about this idea of like the having founders who have a proximity to a problem they're solving. And if you have, venture investors who don't get the problem, I was talking to Shanlin Ma, the founder of Zola. She said, so many investors said, I don't understand why the wedding thing is such a big deal. It doesn't seem like such a big market. And she said, it's a $50 billion a year market. Yeah. I actually think it's bigger now than when she was raising financing, but her investor, all these people she was pitching to were men. They were older. Their wives had planned their weddings decades earlier. They didn't understand the value proposition of what she was tackling. So I think that the diversity argument is really about the understanding opportunities. There's also some really interesting research that I wrote about that totally surprised me about the value of diversity. I always assumed the value of diversity is having people with different perspectives bring something new to the table. Tiffany, I'm sure you bring something new to a table if you're bringing, as a woman in a group that's predominantly male. That totally makes sense to me. What surprised me was the research showing that if you bring an outsider in, everyone else in the group gets smarter. That to me was the overwhelming value of diversity that I don't think people talk about as much. And there's a great study that I write about in the book about fraternities and sororities and what happens when you bring in someone from a different fraternity or sorority. And the thing that's so surprising and I think so powerful is the idea that all the people in the original group, when someone else comes in, they say, wait, we have to re-examine our assumptions. We can't just assume we all agree with each other and we know the same stuff and we're on the same page. having an outsider makes everyone re-examine their assumptions and get smarter. And I think that's what I hope Silicon Valley understands from this is these are crazy financial times. There's so much financial uncertainty. Who knows how the consumer is going to respond to this economic downturn? You're making bets for the long term. You want to have some outsized success stories. And the way to do that is not by just perpetuating a cycle where you invest in the same type of enterprise software companies over and over and over and over. It's trying to find those things that are going to be arbitrage
Yeah, the
opportunities.
outliers. Yeah.
You want to look for outliers. And you know what, if you always want outliers in any business, but one reason I wanted to focus on the tech space is because these are women who've defied, I would say, the highest odds. You'd be hard pressed to find any other sector in American business with fewer women or women having less access to capital than this particular space.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I actually think it's a really good point around diversity. And I think the other thing is like actually just showing people that there are other ways to lead, and seeing that example, and especially like living that, right, when you're in a company and actually seeing that there are many different styles of leadership. And I think that that's what helps perpetuate that going forward as well, right? Like I don't just have to be one way or just have to do things one way, but but obviously you're right, it can lead to very successful financial outcomes, et cetera. And your point earlier around we were talking about how do we get more, how can we back more women, and you mentioned like some women just want to bootstrap and don't want to pitch. And I think like another thing that you talk about in the book is just how like women are very much kind of in the now sometimes, right? And painting a picture of their business that's like very reality, I'd say, kind of like, here's where we are today. It also goes to your gratitude point a little bit, which is like focus on the here and now, and where we're, sometimes the opposite is, like, here's where we're going, here's where we are 5 years from now. And obviously that's good as well, but balancing those two. And I think, it is really important to have that balance. And I think like, especially in today's world, a lot of people are valuing this kind of perspective on where we are today and what does the business look like today. So I hope that this is a catalyst for, for more women to, actually go out and pitch and meet people and raise outside capital. Because again, to the point around like having role models really, or having great examples. And I'm sure if you wrote this book in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, again, you'll have 10 times as many stories as you do today. So it's a good point.
I hope so. I mean, and it's so interesting because what you were saying about talking about the company as it is today. There's so much research about how women pitch their companies differently, and they're asked different questions by investors. And it's not intentional. No one's trying to undersell their company or oversell their company. But women are often socialized not to overpromise and underdeliver. That's the fear, right? I was just talking to some people in academia about how women are more concerned with being perfect, this idea of perfectionism. And that's something that's sort of socialized into women, whereas men are not as afraid to take risks because they're not as afraid of failure. None of this should be the case. Everyone should be equally eager to take risks. But I definitely felt like that, being trained to have a perfectionist thing in myself. But what's so interesting is that women are more likely to talk, as you said, talk with their companies as they are now. Men are saying, well, here's where we are. They don't even talk in the present tense. It's all about the future, where we're going, how big we can be. And what's been so fascinating is talking to founders, having access to this data, reading the research, understanding how maybe they aren't talking about their company the same way as men are. That helps them say, well, at least I have this information now, and I could use this information to make sure I'm presenting myself with the same approach as men are. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that there's research showing that investors are more likely to ask women about the downside risk and more likely to ask men about the upside potential. Knowing that also helps founders. There's so many women I talk to, and I asked them, hey, had you read this study? And they're like, oh yeah, totally helped me out. I went into the pitch meeting. As expected, they said, well, what's the worst case scenario? What happens when the economy tanks? And they said, I was totally ready to answer that question, and then I could pivot on a dime, not waste too much time on it, and give them my best case scenario. I was glad to know that my instinct may have been to undersell my best outcomes. So I think knowledge is power. data is valuable for people on all sides of the equation. Whether you're an investor or whether you're a founder, you need to have access to this research to understand maybe what the human instinct is, which isn't going to do anyone any favors.
What about beyond the founders and investors, Julia? Are there advice that you have for men? Always calls us allies, right? You're an ally, you're a mentor, you're helping give. I mean, it is, and I spend a lot of time with younger people who are up and coming in our industry through All Raise. And the conversations are often about, how do I ask for more compensation? How do I ask for bigger opportunity inside of a firm that's dominated by people that have been there for a long time, mostly men? What advice do you give broadly for men in trying to help them understand, like, what are the things that they can proactively do to create a more level playing field, or at least more opportunity for women?
I think actually mentorship is key.
Yeah.
So many women I know, including myself, have had mostly male mentors simply because that's who's in positions of power.
Right.
A lot of younger women have asked me, how do I get a female mentor? And I say, well, why do you only need a female mentor? Obviously, you should have lots of mentors, or as many that feel right to you, but don't limit yourself to female mentors. You should have a male mentor, because that's where you get the sponsorship, where men are more likely to say, let me look out for my mentee. But I think young women, it's very important to have male mentors, because that's who's more likely to be in power positions. And I think that we just need to change the conversation about that. So obviously mentorship is very valuable, but one thing that's also essential is having men like you, Jeff, say, like, how do I lead? Is it valuable for me to embrace more of these other styles? And I've seen so many men really reconsider the way they've led during this pandemic period, and say, hey, let me think about being more empathetic, and let me think about empathy not as a niceness thing, but as like a really valuable skill, because so many people are going through very different things right now. We are getting these headlines about different back to work rules. How do people feel about going back to work? Wherever you're working, you want your employees to work their hardest, and empathy is going to be really valuable for that. So I think just for men, I hope they take some of the leadership lessons from my book as an opportunity for them to be leading in a way that's authentic to them and also really effective. And I mean, ultimately, I don't want men or women to have to lead in any specific way, but I do want them to be liberated from some of the stereotypes and archetypes that have dominated the sort of the business of leadership for so long. And, whether it's a Jack Welch thing, or the fact that there was a decade when the Mark Zuckerberg move fast and break things model was something, that was a logo that was on Meta's walls, and that was celebrated as like a way to lead a company. And I just don't think anyone should have to feel like, okay, well, this decade it is about this, leadership cliche, and let me try to fit into that. It's like, what's effective for me? What's effective for my team? And what's going to make me a better leader? And I think sort of applying that growth mindset, whether it's to your company or to your own leadership style, I think men can gain a lot from liberating themselves from those archetypes as well.
I would also add, we've had incredible success. A lot of our best male founders are leveraging women mentors. So Margot Georgiadis is a board member of several of our companies, Emmanuel Scala from Toast, Susan St. Ledger, who used to be at Salesforce and Okta, Sarah Fryer, who runs Nextdoor and used to be at Square, Claire Hughes Johnson, who used to be at Stripe, Erica Schultz, who's at Confluent. You'd be amazed how many male founder CEOs I have that reach out to me and say, can you connect me with one of these women who are super, they're not necessarily founders, but badass women that run great companies and have built incredible track records.
And I would say that's essential. That is great advice. The other thing is making sure you have diversity at your company at the early stage.
Yeah,
I've heard a lot of stories about founders. They get to 20 employees and they're like, uh-oh, it's all dudes. We have 20 dudes. What are we going to do? And then it's very hard to hire a female engineer. And so, or a coder. And so organizations like All Raise, but also the #Angels are very focused at just like an awareness of these issues from an early stage, because you don't want to get to have your company grow to a certain size where it's impossible to bring in diversity. And I think that's true at the cap table level as well as at the employee level. And you want to bring in diversity on the cap table and at the employee level when you're at 5 employees. So you're not in a pinch when you're at 20 employees and all of a sudden want to grow really quickly and you cannot convince a woman to come work at your company. So I think simply an awareness of the value of a cognizance of this from the very earliest stages can really pay off over the long run.
100%. I actually think, like, I truly have seen, even over the last 5 years, diversity is a very meaningful part of the conversation. And I think people are thinking about it from day one, which obviously helps. And like Jeff said, it's at the board level, it's obviously at the team level, and across industry. So, I think that will, it takes time, obviously, but I think it's a good step forward.
Julie, I know you got to go back on air.
Thank you so much.
Thank
You're
you for
both
spending
awesome.
time
And
with
I
us.
love watching the success of your portfolio companies. So
thank you.
send them my way so I can learn more about them.
All right. Thanks for spending time with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.